Hey everyone, and welcome back to another week of discussion in gender and society. I just want to share that I'm so excited about this class, especially after the first few weeks of Canvas discussions and seeing how, your thoughtful perspectives are really invested in not, reducing complicated discussions to simple answers, but rather really delving into various dimensions of complicated topics. So, thank you for that so far. And this week we are essentially doing a bit of a part two of what we started last week in terms of thinking about the social construction of both sex and gender, and engaging with different sociological perspectives on that topic. So, first up is we are thinking about that Suzanne Kessler piece, where Suzanne Kessler is investigating the ways that the medical field has really reproduced various understandings of, biological sex being, situated in a binary. So thinking about biological sex as being something that, is conformed to the rigid categorization of, binary understanding. So, she's investigating this topic by thinking about intersex children and thinking about, we would define intersex as being, essentially referring to those born with, some variation of chromosomes, gonads, in other words, ovaries or testes, the reproductive organs, some variation of genitalia that defies binary sex categorization. So, one particular theory that Suzanne Kessler investigates is, Money and Earhart's theory of gender proposed first. So this is essentially a theory that has really been taken as, an accepted logic that the medical establishment has engaged with. So this theory puts forward that it's up to parents and medical professionals to essentially fashion or mold the child with hormones or surgeries in order to fit particular binary understandings of sex so that the assigned sex can then correspond with intended gender. So, as we know now after, these last, few weeks of class, this is essentially a way of molding a child to conform to cisgender experience rather than allowing some space for fluidity or ambiguity. So it's interesting that Kessler even notes that, endocrinologists and other, medical professionals even noted that they don't necessarily know how effective this method is. It's really just been something that's been taken as a rule of thumb, and has essentially become something that's become commonplace knowledge in medical establishments. And it's important to note how investigating the gendered assumptions that are really situated in that theory's continuation as a rule of thumb lies in this concern for creating trauma for the child and caregivers as time goes on. So, in other words, there's this fear that experiencing biological sex outside of a binary and navigating resulting gender identification in ways that defy binary categorization as well, that this will create some kind of hardship or difficulty for child and parent. So the theory contends that it's best to make these decisions prior to the baby being able to remember this experience of, going through some kind of variation of, chromosomes, hormones, or genitalia. So, through Kessler's article, we see that, the presence of clearly formed genitalia really takes priority and precedent as the primary indication of proper sex assignment. So, such as the case of the XX individual or, the infant that, Kessler points out. So this particular infant, the XX infant with, formed ovaries and a fully formed penis, it was more ideal for the physicians to recommend removing the ovaries and keeping the fully formed penis, and doing hormone replacement therapy, while preserving the child's genitalia. So it's interesting to think about in these various cases that Kessler looks at. We see even, thinking back to our conversations last week, the ways that we tend to culturally equate the presence of particular genitalia with, sex categorization and whatnot. So thinking about, despite the fact that intersex children, represent this, variety of different, experiences with regards to, diverse chromosomes, various gonads, thinking about the combination of, chromosomes, gonads, and genitalia, varies tremendously in intersex children. But with that, having some sort of clearly formed, genitalia tends to really shape decision making in terms of, how hormones or surgery then, impact the physician and parents' understanding of, what sort of, box they're going to, fit the child into. So, it's important to keep in mind that Kessler's piece was written in 1990. So, historically contextualizing this piece helps us think about, what has changed in medical establishments and what hasn't changed in medical institutions when it comes to that rigid desire to categorize in accordance with a binary, so either male or female, as opposed to thinking about what it looks like to, enable the child to, have some room for exploring like fluidity, just having that ambiguity and making decisions later on. So this is something that is an interesting conversation, and, I'm curious what folks' perspective is on this, in terms of thinking about making that decision for the child before they're able to, remember this experience. So, and of course thinking about, the variety of intersex experiences where that it's not necessarily the case that, children necessarily don't know what had happened. Parents may tell the children, what had gone on, and then, give them space for, thinking about what impact that had on them, going forward. So, there's a lot of room for variation, in this conversation. There's so many different experiences when it comes to this. So, it's interesting to think about putting Kessler's piece in conversation with the Dean Spade piece that I asked you all to look at, the about purportedly gendered body parts piece. So, Kessler's discussion, folks may have noticed it clearly genders reproductive organs and body parts. So, it uses language like, female reproductive system, female anatomy, and things like that. Where Dean Spade is asking us to rethink how we talk about body parts in order to, expand discussions that, involve gender, specifically the way that we talk about bodies. So, for instance, in connecting this even to, our contemporary political landscape and thinking about, the Texas abortion ban that many folks have been talking about, while there's been this, big discussion around, the implications this has, the impact it's going to have on a variety of people, there's also been, this paired discourse around how we talk about reproductive justice. So in terms of thinking about how often, different forms of binary language tend to frame how we talk about reproductive justice. So thinking about, centering the conversation around, how this particular issue impacts women. And it, of course, it impacts a variety of women, but thinking about how important it is to consider, following Dean Spade's conversation, if we expand our language around, instead of thinking about, how it's limiting the discussion to how it's only, women that, experience menstruation, expanding how we understand womanhood, expanding language around, people who menstruate, thinking about the amount of non-binary, genderqueer, and trans folks that, are left out of the conversation when things get reduced to explicitly binary terms. So, to continue this thread, considering how, Dean Spade is thinking about, if we left behind language like female organs or like female parts, male organs or male parts, and instead opened that up to, thinking about the ways that we can talk about, different, reproductive justice issues, and various issues around like health justice issues that go beyond reproductive justice, but thinking about, how we can, make that language more inclusive. So, thinking about, Dean Spade is really delving into the issue of biological determinism. So when we think about, biological determinism, it's this notion that body parts are destiny and that determines our gender identity. So, in other words, someone can have ovaries and identify or express themselves as a man. So opting for language like people with ovaries, or people who can menstruate, helps us understand that particular body parts are not determinant of how we experience gender. So similarly, someone can produce sperm and identify as non-binary, and saying that they have male organs props up the notion that only the production of sperm is solely associated with being a man. So if we reframe this discussion and think about using more inclusive language, it moves us away from that notion of, biological determinism reinforcing this idea that body parts make us who we are and produce a destiny for us, but rather, opens up the discussion in a big way. So it's important to note in this discussion too that biological determinism goes hand in hand with gender essentialism. And if biological determinism can be understood as this idea of creating a gender destiny based on gendering particular body parts and whatnot, gender essentialism would essentially be this idea of categorizing people based on, what is deemed as like an innate or, inherent trait associated with gender. So, gender essentialism would, take shape, for instance, as, identifying, women as being nurturing, being empathetic as being, this feminine trait, while we know from that Judith Lorber piece that when we continuously encourage this in certain genders and not others, it continuously produces and reproduces understandings of gender, essentially creating this feedback loop, where the presence of those traits in particular people, because they have been, encouraged and, continuously reinforced in particular folks, then creates a feedback loop where it's, culturally understood as being an innate or inherent trait of certain folks. So, this really does a disservice to folks of all genders because it kind of creates a pigeonholed perspective on what people are capable of, on what people are good at, and whatnot. So, it is important to see how that sense of biological determinism goes hand in hand with gender essentialism. So, we'll talk about this more on the discussion board. We'll break this down a little bit more, and I really look forward to seeing what you all have to say about this topic.